Um, the closest I ever came to believing in ghosts in a real sense was at my grandmother's funeral, when I guess I knew she had a sister, but she was very, very old and frail, and we were at the grave, we're at the graveside, and there, sitting in one of those little flimsy funeral home chairs, was like my grandmother. It was just like there she was, and for a split second, I thought I was, like seeing a ghost, and then I found it was a sister named Helen, who was also old and frail, and so I was like laughing about that afterwards, because of course I don't believe in ghosts, right? I mean, ghosts aren't real. From the West, and we have to not believe more than we have to believe in these things. But um, I'm cursed with this Western mind that kind of wants me to understand how things work and are put together. And I was also a missionary in Haiti, where the mindset is quite different. And I had to answer questions like, not only do you believe in ghosts, but do you believe in curses, and do you believe in witchcraft, and do you believe that a person can transform into a cow and walk around at night without a head, and then transform back into a person um, in the morning? And I would always look at them and say, I'll have to think about that. So when I look at Thomas, and this story, he's got the name Doubting Thomas, which I think is kind of a little bit sad, because basically he's got this name because he doesn't believe in ghosts, right? It's like, he saw Jesus die. Like all the 12, he ran away and hid, but he knew that Jesus um, was actually dead. They buried him. And so to have the word come around like, oh, we've seen Jesus, he's just like, I hear you, and I'm gonna have to think about that. Like, I have a feeling that he was kind of thinking, well, I don't know what's really going on. But the good thing about it is he didn't walk away just because he didn't believe in ghosts. He kind of stayed with his group, and they were all, hunkered down, and they were all hiding, because now that Jesus had been killed, they were the next in line in a lot of ways, because they were his intimate followers. And so they were all locked up and hiding and being all scared, and then this ghost appears among them. The door's locked, and Jesus appears. And so that would be weird by itself, right? First of all, but then all the question of, they all were there and they believed, but Thomas wasn't there. And so when Jesus shows up the second time, does he shimmer in and like, peace be to you. I was like, I'm glad he says that at the beginning, because I still think my heart would still kind of stop if I saw him standing there. But he comes back and makes sure that Thomas sees him. And I like that even though Thomas didn't walk away, he was still wrestling with these doubts, that when Jesus showed up, the invitation wasn't to scold Thomas for not believing, right? But it was to draw Thomas closer in and say, look here at my side, and here's my hands, And it's almost like I want to think that, like, Jesus wasn't about to finish this earthly ministry of his without making sure that Thomas believed and saw him. Now, we interesting enough is that when we first see Thomas in this kind of story earlier a bit, during Lazarus's episode, and he's rallying the troops to go and die with Jesus. But like I said, he and the other 12, as soon as Jesus was arrested and got in trouble, they kind of ran away. But still, he says, unless I see and touch, I'm not going to believe. And then it sounds like doubt, but really it's just honesty, right? That's the way I look at it. It's like, it sounds like he should have believed, because didn't Jesus talk about this? Well, yes, he did, but no, they didn't understand it at the time, and they sure didn't understand it after seeing him flogged and beaten and nailed to a cross and bleeding and screaming and dying and getting up the ghost and then being buried. Like, it's just honest. And he ran, Jesus died, Jesus was buried, and that was it. And he wasn't going to play make-believe. He wouldn't believe and pretend to believe. And so when Jesus didn't leave him behind, he came back and he said, put your fingers here. And then I found myself thinking Thomas wasn't as much of a doubter as he thought, because we don't have any record that he actually touched Jesus. And Jesus said, hey, here's my hands and here's my side. And instead, he falls to his knees and he makes the clearest proclamation in all of the Gospels of who Jesus was when he says, my Lord and my God. History tells us then that from that point, we have a different Thomas. Kind of like we have a different Peter in Acts 2. And we have a different Thomas in church history. And now church history after the Gospels were written, there's a lot of crazy stories that people were writing. There were a lot of Christian people writing about their experiences. And some of them included stories about the apostles, but they grew into kind of like exaggerated fish stories, like how big the fish you caught. And then they grew into these like massively legendary stories. And so we have to kind of really not believe most of those stories that we hear in some of these histories. But behind the stories, there's usually a kernel of truth, and we kind of go with that. But in the case of Thomas, we have one of the strongest cases of actually knowing what happened to an apostle outside of what the Bible tells us, and that's that he became one of the earliest missionaries and went to India and established the church there. Now, if going to India, there was a story. He said, one of the stories was that someone told him he was going to be a missionary, and he basically said, "Great, I'll go anywhere in the realm except India." And so, and I relate to that story because I wanted to be a missionary and I wanted to go anywhere in the world, but we didn't mean Haiti, did you? Like, Haiti, like. But when Thomas goes to India, from Jerusalem to India, where he landed, is about 4,000 kilometers. And Paul gets all the ink in Acts, right? We hear of his missionary journeys, but the distance from Rome to Jerusalem was about 2,500 kilometers. So in a sense, we have this great story of Thomas going out thousands and thousands of miles by boat and trade routes and, walking and just taking forever to get to India. And I wonder, how was he going to convince people that what he saw was real when he didn't believe it was real? How do you convince others? You say, well, yeah, I saw him. But he's like, Peter said I saw him too. And like, I don't know how Thomas could make it any clearer. So I love the fact that in John's gospel, he writes this extra bit to this story. He writes this kind of nice little capsule that says, it's great. You saw and believed, but think about how great it's going to be that those who never saw will also believe. And I think that's Thomas, because he's got to go knowing that he was one of the 12, knowing that he ran away, knowing that Jesus came back for him, basically didn't let him go by himself, and that he wrestled with his doubts, and now he has a chance to convince others, to tell others, to show others. And in fact, we have today in that part of India, there's the St. Thomas Christian Church as a group of ethnically group of Catholic, Protestants, Orthodox, different believers who trace their faith back to Thomas, establishing the church there. And it's a wonderful story to hear that they trace their roots back all the way to Thomas, and they still cling to it as a part of their identity. And I want to be able to say, it's like those times when we need to find a way to hold on to something. We want to believe, but instead we have doubts. And Thomas, I think the thing that gives me the most hope is that it shows us that doubting isn't really that hard for God to deal with. I know that there's a type of doubting which is like fiercely rejecting even though you should believe. I know there's a type of doubting, but when you're honestly wrestling with something, I think this story goes with us in saying, hey, Jesus has not yet finished. He's going to come back to you. And your wrestling won't be in vain. In fact, I love that image of wrestling when Jacob wrestles with the spiritual being, an angel or God, whoever it was, and I just like the idea of like, it reminds me of when my kids were little and, we'd all wrestle on the ground and they really believed they could take me down, and even though physics wasn't on their side, it was the fact that I was wrestling with them. And I feel like that there's stories where Habakkuk was wrestling, in his spirit with whether God's justice was really just. And there's Paul and his story about how he wrestled with what to do after he saw the risen Jesus and he was blinded. And all these stories of this intermediate time of having questions and doubts, I think that I appreciate the fact that our faith doesn't require us to just blindly obey without doubt. Now, it's always difficult because it's like I don't doubt, but at the same time I have had doubts. And I sometimes wrestle through those doubts to this day. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I got some really good earphones for the first time in my life. I grew up, FM radio, AM, FM radio, and you couldn't really hear the songs. And you didn't know what the songs were saying half the time because the quality was so bad. And there was this song that I would listen to, and I really liked it because I liked the lyrics that I heard in my head better than the lyrics I heard when I started listening on these earphones because they were different. But one of them was, and if the God that you believe in don't wrestle, then it's none of my business. Okay, but come to find out it wasn't wrestle. The guy, it was anyway. But the whole idea of wrestling with God seems to be disobedient. And I wonder if we can just say it's just being honest. I want to say that when you look at this and you see it and you see Thomas, in this story especially, because John likes all of these very philosophical words, but this one looks very, very real to me. And not just like what it means in some general idea to follow the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but it's like, well, the Word came in front of me and I saw his hands and I saw his feet. And I think that the thing that I take away from it is that we are not asked to pretend to believe, and we are not asked to not have struggles, but we are invited to bring our real questions and our real hearts and our real struggles to a real Savior, and not be afraid of the conversations and the questions that we have to have, and to be patient with ourselves and with God as we wrestle through things, knowing that Jesus' desire for us is so strong that he will come back. So today, if you're wondering, wrestling, or feeling left out or uncertain, or maybe your group is so much better than you are and you just wish you could be better like them, if you're feeling that, just remember that your doubts don't put you on the outside of God's story. That you are exactly the kind of person that Jesus doesn't leave behind, and that he's going to come looking for you. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you